Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial in my series on how to build a desktop application style object-oriented Discord bot in Python. So if you're still with me so far, that's super exciting. I'm really excited to have you along. And I think now that we're at this point, the next logical step is to store the data that we're retrieving from the user. So currently our bot doesn't have a way of storing data between lifespans. So once it shuts down, we lose the character name and the rates and the jobs and things like that we've entered. And obviously that's not the behavior we're looking for, right? So we're going to create a PostgreSQL database in this tutorial, and then we're going to see how to get this information in the profile details class into this database and retrieve it from the database in a meaningful and optimized way. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at, and let's get started. So to start off, I want to get us a database. Okay, we need something to store stuff to. And for that purpose, I found a free Postgres database online called neon.tech. Okay, so I used a Heroku Postgres database when I initially developed the bot, but those do cost $5 now, minimum, so I want to make sure that there's a free alternative for everyone who's using the tutorial. So for that, we're going to use neon.tech, okay? Because they have a very generous free tier, and let's take a look at that really fast. Let's go ahead and sign in. Okay, and then once you've created your account and signed in, we're just going to create a project, and we're going to call it Frogbot, okay? Current Postgres is fine, and then you can go ahead and select the region that's closest to you. I'm on the West Coast, so I'll select the West region. Okay, now we're going to want this connection string here in a second, but let's close this out and let's just take a look at the information that we're being presented here. So let's take a look at their free tier documentation. And right here is the info that we're looking at, okay? So we get 10 branches, which we won't really need. That's essentially 10 different connections to the database, and we're only going to ever have our one single bot. We do get 3 gigabytes of storage, which is pretty generous amount of database storage. Okay, but the main thing we're looking at is that we have no limit on active computing time for the primary branch. All right, so if you put your bot into production, your users are always going to have access to the database branch that we're going to be using to develop the bot. Otherwise, you'll only have 100 worker hours, and that's not a lot. That's only 3.5 days or so worth of worker time. So it's very generous that they're giving unlimited worker time on the primary branch. So we're going to take advantage of that for this tutorial. So back over on the dashboard here, the connection string is what we're looking at. So we're going to grab this guy right here. Now, we could go over here to the SQL editor and we could run our commands here to create the database and to define our tables and our views and things like that. And then we can do all of our editing under tables, but I don't want to do that. This is code-based tutorial, so we're gonna make sure that all of our stuff is created and asserted within our code. Okay, so let's copy over this connection string and let's head back over into our project. And then let's open our .env file. All right, because this is a secret token, just like our Discord token, and I want to define that here. So we're going to say database URL equals the connection string that we copied from Neon database, okay? Or excuse me, neon.tech. So this connection string, let's post that in here. And let's also close this window because that is extremely bright. Okay. Okay, so let's close the .env file, and then in utilities directory, let's make a new Python file called database.py. And then this is where we're going to be defining our database logic, okay? So let's first go down here to the Python packages installer, and I've typed it in here already, but scopc2 is the package that we use to interface with PostgreSQL databases. So either look for it here or Google PostgreSQL Python library and get the spelling that way. But either way, let's install it into our project. And then in our database file, I want to first import OS as well as the SciComm2 database library that we're using to interface. And then for a little bit later, since we're going to need this, we're going to need from Discord, let's import guild. And then from typing, let's import list and optional as well. Okay? Oh, excuse me. And from .env, let's import load.env. Okay? Because we need to access that .env file where we defined our database URL, the secret code that's going to get us in. Okay, so let me drop in a horizontal rule here. And then let's define that database URL so we're not being ambiguous with it when we put it in our code. So let's say database URL equals os.getEnv. And then what did we call it? We called it a database URL. Okay. But we also need to call load.env with no parameters beforehand, before we can access that environment file, okay? All right, cool. So let's get connected. So let's drop down here, and we're going to say db connection equals scicop2.connect. Nope, .connect. And we're going to first pass in the database URL as the parameter, and then for the SSL mode equals require in lowercase, okay? Just like that. And then under here, I want to say print database connection initialized. Initialized. There we go. Okay. Great. So as part of loading all the modules in this project, we're automatically going to create a connection to this database. And as long as the project is active and running, we will have an active connection that we can access in this way. Okay, so let's make our dunderall so that we can export that and not grab all the rest of this stuff that we're importing. So let's say dunderall equals... Down here, we'll say database connection. I know we're exporting kind of a dynamic variable here, but that's the way that I want to do it for the time being. We may come back and refactor this, okay? But for the time being, this is all we need to connect to the database. All right, so in theory, when we load our project, we should be good to go. Let's also, before we do that, let's go in here to our .init. And we're going to say from .database import star. Okay, so now we have that database connection available for the rest of the project. Okay, so let's really quick just start the bot. All right, database connection initialized. Very good. Oh, we were in the current file. Okay, well, either way, that means that the connection that it worked, that we have access to our database. So let's open the main file here, and let's run our normal bot, and there you can see we have our connection initialized, and we're online. Okay, so let's go ahead, close the bot, and head back over to our database. Now the way that I want to accomplish this is that we're going to make a function that we call within the load logic of main for the time being. So on ready, we're going to call this function that's going to assert the tables in the database. So basically it's going to create the tables if they don't exist, otherwise it'll skip it. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's define assert database structure. Okay, it's not going to take any parameters and it doesn't return anything. And the first thing I want to do is say C equals database connection dot cursor. And this is how we're going to interact with the database through the cursor. And the first thing I want to do is I want to create a table of profile base data. So we're going to have the internal data. So if we jump back over here to our handy PowerPoint, this is the internal data right here. So this is going to be the identifying information, particularly this unique ID. This is going to be how we identify the profiles and link all of this information together. Okay? So the first thing that we need to define is that profile table. So I'm going to say c.execute, and I'll drop down because this might be a little wordy. And we'll say create table if not exists profiles and an open bracket. And we're going to define these three fields. So profile ID is text. We want it to be unique and it cannot be null. Okay, so we are always going to have a profile ID. Make sure we put a comma after each statement. And let's define the user ID. It's going to be a big integer, which basically means, I don't remember how many characters a big integer stores, but Discord ID numbers are 17 characters now. So we need this data type to be able to hold that many numbers. Okay, and then we don't want this to be null either. We always want to have a user assigned to the profile. And let's say guild ID as well, and that's going to be a big int as well. And down here I want to put constraint profile underscore p key primary key, and then in parentheses we're going to put profile ID, and we're going to close both sets of parentheses. So we had one after we created the table, and let's close that here at the end as well. Okay, so the other SQL statement that I'd like to write before we commit this one for sure is I'd also like to create the details table in the event that it doesn't exist. So we're going to say create table if not exists. Okay, so the table we want to create is details and open bracket. First thing is the profile ID, which is text. It needs to be unique and it cannot be null. Okay, next is character name, and that's text. Next is URL, also text. Color, and we're going to store that as an integer value, so this 16-bit integer that we can derive from a color class. Jobs is going to be stored as text, and you'll see why. Rates also stored as a text field. And then also our post URL, which is text. So lots of text in the details column. And let's go ahead and add that constraint here as well. So details underscore p key, primary key, and then in here we're going to put profile ID and close both sets of brackets. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is actually make sure that the database commits this. So we're going to say dbconnection.commit. And then just to clean up, we'll say c.close. So we don't have random cursors to the database open for the lifespan of our bot. Okay, so this is all that we need to do to set up the database. I have a database browser here. And, there we go. As you can see, I have Frogbot pulled down right here. Let me get my pen. So here's Frogbot. And I've drilled into the database structure all the way down here to tables. And you can see that I've dropped that down and we don't have any tables for the time being. Okay? So let me minimize this. And over here in our main file, I'd like to go to the top and I'd like to say from utilities, and we're going to import the assert database entries. Oh, I'm sorry. We did not add that to our init. No, we did. We didn't add that to our dunder all. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So back in our database.py, let's go ahead and add assert database structure to dunder all, which will allow us to import it in our main file. Okay? So down here, let's do a print statement, and we're going to say asserting database structure. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to say assert database structure, just like that. And if we run our bot, we have a connection initialized, and once we get Frogbot online, we know that that database structure was asserted. So if we open up pgadmin and refresh, we have two tables with the columns that we defined, just like that. Okay, and if I remove this panel, oops, don't need to save that. Apologies, folks. Don't save. And if we mouse over this table and go to the SQL pane, this is more or less the code that we wrote in our database module. So you can always check here to see if everything worked. But like I said, we have profiles with 3 columns and we've got details with 7. So that was successful, and that's all we need to get started with storing and retrieving our data. Okay, so let's head over into our database.py again, and let's write a function to take advantage of those tables. So let's make a new profile entry in those tables, okay? So I'm going to define new profile entry, and what this is going to take in is a guild ID, which is an integer, and a user ID, which is an integer. Now you might be wondering, where's the profile ID? What are we going to do about that? Well, what I'd like to do, and this is going to return an optional string. And you'll see what what this is going to do is this is going to return the profile ID, because within this function is where we're going to get that ID and define it and insert it into the database. So first off, let me go to the top, and under scicop2 for the import, let me import UUID. Okay? And we're going to use this to create unique string ID. Okay, so let's initialize our cursor again. So C equals dbconnection.cursor. And then I'm going to say c.execute. So the first thing that we want to do is check our profiles table to see if there's a guild ID user ID combination. Because in theory, there should never be more than 1 profile per guild. Now later on, we're going to allow multiple profiles per user, because again, the user might be in multiple guilds that utilize the bot. And in addition, we want to add, much further down the line, we're going to add support for having a global profile template that you can import into a server. And that's something that you're going to be able to access through private messages. But again, that's a long way down the line. But we want to plan for it now in the structure of our table. So let's say select star from profiles where guild ID equals %s and user ID equals %s. Okay, and then we're going to say comma, and let's pass in the guild ID and the user ID. Okay, so let's check for the record, and we're going to say c.fetch1. There should only ever be 1 record that has to do with this pairing. Okay, so if the record exists, because otherwise it's going to return us, if we mouse over this here, it's going to return us a tuple of any values. So potentially this tuple could be empty, and an empty tuple equates to false. So we can just say if record, let's raise a value error. Okay, so this profile already exists, which means that we have called this incorrectly, and we need to address that. Okay, so we should never ever be calling this function unless we know that we need a new profile. And so if there's an error, if there's a reason that we're calling this despite a profile existing, we want to raise here just for our own internal situation, just so that we know and we can fix that. Okay, so I want to make a new profile ID, and I'm going to set that equal to UUID dot UUID4. Okay, and that doesn't take any parameters in the function. And then I want to say dot hex, because that's going to return us the string hex of the new profile ID. And after we run this, I'm just going to say print new profile ID, just so that we can see what's been generated. Okay, so now I want to create the records in the files. So these tables up here need records. So let's say c.execute, and I'm going to say insert into profiles, because if we've gotten to this point, we know 100% that this combination, this profile does not exist. So we've created a new ID, and we're going to enter these values. So into profiles, and we're going to open parentheses. We're going to say profile ID, user ID, and guild ID. And then we're going to say values outside the parentheses, and then more parentheses, and 3% s's, lowercase s. Keep that in mind. Okay, and then outside the quotations, we're going to put a comma, and we're going to say new profile ID. User ID, and you guessed it, guild ID, just like that. Let's also say c.execute, insert into details, and all we need to do for this one is insert the profile ID, because the rest of the data in details is nullable, and the user hasn't entered it yet, so we don't want to include any default values or anything like that. Values, and then %s in parentheses. And we'll drop down and say new profile ID. We need to input a tuple here to the execute function for the formatting of the string, so make sure after new profile ID we include a comma, because that makes the parentheses, that makes this a tuple. Okay, so let's run dbconnection.commit, and let's close our cursor, clean up after ourselves, and then I want to return the new profile ID, because we're going to, once we run this and create the profile ID, then we're going to load this into a new profile. So we don't create the profile first, the profile class first, we actually create the database entry, and then from that we can create the profile. And then of course up here at the top, let's make sure we export new profile, or new profile entry. Okay, great. So I think this covers everything that we need in the database for right now. So let's exit out of that. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to go into our profile section. Okay, so let's add a couple of things to this contract. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to define a class method. And we're going to use this class method to load the new profile section, whichever it may be. So at class method, and we're going to say def load, and this is going to take in the class. Okay, and then we're going to, and the class is of type T. And let's make sure we import type from from typing, excuse me. Okay, so T again is a generic type. It's standing in for whichever type of profile section class this ends up being. Okay, and of course we're going to get the parent in here. And we're also going to get the data. So this is going to pass us our database information once we pull all of it out of the database. And let's make sure we put any up here in our imports. Okay, and then this is going to return a finalized class, whatever class that is. So we just put T there. And of course, we're going to raise a not implemented error here because we aren't going to implement the logic in the superclass. We're going to implement it on a case-by-case basis. All right, and then I'd also like to create one down here at the bottom, and we're going to call this def update. And it doesn't take any parameters, doesn't return anything, and again, we will raise a not implemented error and implement this in the subclasses. Okay, so we can exit out of our section, and here in our profile details, let's go ahead and define our update method. So down here at the bottom, let's go ahead and say def update, and again, it's going to try and autocomplete that because it's super great. And what do we want to do here? Well, actually, I apologize. Let's go back up to the top. And okay, we are importing everything from utilities, so that's good. Okay, so down here, I want to say c equals dbconnection.cursor, and we're going to do this every time. I prefer to do it on a case-by-case basis when we open a cursor instead of opening a single cursor and using it throughout the bot. Okay, and then here for the query, c.execute, and then we're going to say update the details table, and we're going to set character name equal to %s, and make sure we put a comma after each assignment. URL is equal to %s, color is equal to %s, jobs, rates, and post URL equals %s, where profile ID equals %s. Okay, so let's put a comma after the quotation marks, and we'll drop down and create a tuple here. So we're just going to input the variables in order, and we'll make sure that they're the underlying data points, not the properties. Because if we end up getting an NS Sentinel value back from the property, it's gonna throw an error because Postgres doesn't necessarily know how to handle that. So just keep that in mind. Self.rates, self.postURL, and then self.parent.id. Because remember, we're referring back to the parent profile here. And let's say dbconnection.commit. Close our cursor. All right. And this is our update method. But if you've got some astute observation skills, you may have noticed that we just put in the underlying value for self.color. However, we defined the color as an integer in the database. So why don't we just put self.color, why don't we just put int self.color? Right? Well, that we don't want to do that because we may have a none value, and that'll throw an error in the int converter. So what I want to do up here, oops, red squiggly, we're going to say color value equals self.color.value, which is going to give us that raw integer value, if self.color is not none, else none. Else we'll just put a null value in there. And let's substitute the color value into the query. Okay, so this is going to update that database information, and because we're updating all the fields each time, we don't have to necessarily pass in a specific field to update. Okay, but this isn't getting called at all yet, right? So we don't have, where are we going to call this update logic? Well, if you've been paying attention up till now, I did mention a couple of tutorials ago that we would be putting update logic in our properties, right? So in the setter, what I want to do is after we set the value, I want to call self.update, just like that. And so every time we set a value through the property setter, we're automatically going to call that update. So we don't necessarily have to do that elsewhere in our code because we could forget, right? Okay. So I want to call self.update in all of our properties. In the color property, make sure we're outside the if-else block. Okay. Do for jobs, rates, and our post URL, just like that. And so that is going to save our data in the database. Now, before we test, I also want to set up the load class method because that's going to pull data from the database. Okay. So let's scroll back up here, and we're going to put this class method right under the init method, since both of these are going to give us a final finished class. Okay, so let's define @class method, and we're going to say def load, which is going to autocomplete for me. Now, underneath our dunder all, and up in our imports, what I'd like to import is type and type var. And then under our dunder all, I want to define the type variable that we're going to use in here as opposed to t. Okay, so I'm going to say pd equals typevar, and the first parameter is a string version of the variable name that we just assigned. And then we're going to say bound equals profile details, just like that. And that's going to bind this variable for type checking purposes to this class. Okay, so let's substitute that in here, and this is also going to return PD. And from typing, let's import any. Actually, excuse me, we're not going to import any. We just need a list here. Okay. So let me drop this down because we do need a little bit of space. And for my data points, what I actually want to pass is a list of optional union string or int. Okay, so we have a list of optional values, and they're either going to be a string or an integer, which if we open our database really quick, right here, this is the table that we've pulled data from, and all we have are strings or integers in this table. So it's easiest just to say it's going to be one of those two things. Okay, and then let me dedent this. Okay, so all I want to do here is I want to sift through the data, and I just want to assign it and return the class. Okay, so this isn't going to actually have any logic in it, but it's just going to break everything down for us. So we're going to say the parent for the class equals the parent, the character name equals char name equals, I'm sorry, this is going to be data sub 0 because it's the first data point after the profile name, after the profile ID in our details table. So our custom URL, and the reason that we're doing it this way is that I don't want to have this messy load, this load logic here in the init class. I want the init class solely to be for assigning these values. Okay, just so you're aware. So custom URL equals data sub 1 because it's the next data point. And let's just go through this really quick here. Color equals color, and then we'll put the integer value in there. But be careful because we want to check for none if data sub 2 is not none, else none. So we don't want to try and convert none. Let's say for now jobs equals data sub 3. We're going to come back to this because technically it's a list that's been stored in the database, and we want to address that. We need to parse the list, but for now let's just assign this value and we'll come back. Let's say rates equals data sub 4, and we're going to say post URL equals data sub 5, right? Got character name, URL, color, jobs, rates, post URL. Excellent. Okay. So that's all 6 of our data points. So what are we going to do about jobs? How does it store this information? Well, when you pass a list into Postgres, what it's doing is it's literally converting that list into a string that looks like this. Okay, so we're literally getting a string within brackets indicating that this is a list. But how do we parse this? Well, I'm going to be honest, I've spent a lot of time looking at the documentation, and I still don't quite understand how to get an array back from Postgres. So I've devised a rather hacky way to do it, and we're going to use that way. I'm sure I'm going to get messages in the comments about the proper way to do it, and honestly, I would love that because I am clueless in terms of returning an array from Postgres. Okay, so let's go down here to the bottom, and we're going to define a new function called draw. What is this new function? This is going to be convert database list. Okay, so what are we going to do in this function? So first thing, this is going to take some data, all right? And this data is an optional string. Because remember, the list is stored as a string value. And then we're going to return a list of strings, which is the underlying data point for our jobs, okay? So what's the logic here? So the first thing we want to do is if we've passed a none value, so if the data point that we've retrieved from the database here is none, we just want to return an empty list, okay? Or if we've stored an empty list in the database. So first thing we're going to check if data is none or not data. So if it's false for some reason, or data equals an empty list, but Postgres style, we're just going to return a blank list. Okay, so basically if there's no data, we're going to return the no data value. Okay, so let's say that the base list equals list comprehension, I for I in data.lstrip. Okay, so we want to get rid of these things from the left side. We want to get rid of the bracket. .rstrip, and we're going to get rid of the bracket from the right side. And then I want to split the values at the comma, at each comma. Just like that. Okay, so now we have a list of data of string values that have been split at these commas. So we basically have our list. But the issue is that when we store a list, it stores all of the list elements in quotation marks. So what we want to do is we want to return another list comprehension, and we're going to say I.strip, and we're going to get rid of the apostrophes, the single quotation marks from either side. And then I also want to .strip double quotation marks, just on the off chance that quotation marks were used within the value in the string, because then they're escaped with single quotation marks. So we want to make sure we cover for both for I in base list. So we're going through the base list, we're stripping the quotation marks off of each element, and then we're returning a final list of elements. Okay? So let's put that in our all convert database list. Okay, and let's go over here to details, and let's wrap this in the convert database list, just like that. Okay, oops, comma goes outside. There we go. And this is how we're going to get our data back. But where are we going to call the load method? Okay, let's work our way backwards. So now we're going to be going into the actual profile parent class, which up to this point has been empty. But now we're going to put the logic in here to load each of the sections in turn. And that's where this class is going to come in handy the most, is that we're going to use it for the loading and the saving and the compiling of all of its child data. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll define our constructor. So let's drop down here and we'll say def init. And let's go ahead and drop this down as well, because we're gonna need room to define each of these data points, and that could get a little bit long, so we'll use vertical space. And then here I want to put an asterisk indicating that all of these are going to be keyword arguments, just to prevent any ambiguity when we're passing information into the class methods that we'll be defining in a minute. Okay, so the first thing I want to get is the profile ID. And this is going to be a string, but it's not optional. Next is going to be the user. So we're actually going to have a Discord user object attached to this profile so that we have all the extra functionality of a user. So this is actually going to be a union though, because it could be a member, could be a user, or it could be an integer. And if you remember way back in, I think, video 2 or 3, we discussed the fact that we might have an integer here simply because an account with Discord may be deleted, but we don't necessarily want to, completely delete the reference to that profile. In the event that someone reactivates their account with Discord and decides that they want to repost a profile, we want their profile to still be within the bot's memory and still be accessible. So in the event that there's a deleted user, we're just going to keep the profile in memory, but store it with an integer here instead. Okay, so then we're going to get a guild, and this is going to be optional, remember. And then we're going to take a Discord guild to start. We're going to make a custom guild data class once we start talking about server configuration and where we're going to be posting these profiles. So eventually we'll substitute that in here, but for now let's just take a regular Discord guild. Okay, and then I also want to take in each of the sections. So for now, we're just going to take in a details. And then let's make sure that we import details. So from classes.profiles, let's import profile details. So then details is going to be of type profile details. Okay, we'll add these other ones in a little bit later as we create them, but for now I just want to have the internal data points and profile details. And then let's also import guild up here from Discord namespace. Okay, awesome. So let's assign our data points here in the init. So we'll say self.id, which is a string, is equal to the profile ID. Self.user, which is a union member user int, that's going to equal the user. Self.guild is an optional guild, and that's going to equal the guild that we passed in. And then down here we'll say self.details, which is profile details, equals the details object we passed in. Okay, Pretty straightforward initializer, right? Great. So now when we create a profile, we can't simply say init and pass a new profile ID. Why is that? Because during the course of initializing a new profile, we will also be initializing the sections. And in order for the sections to initialize properly, if we look back in here in our details, we need to have an initialized parent profile already instantiated to pass in. So you can see the issue here where we need to have this completed before we can even create the object that we want to pass in. So you can see that gets a little messy, but luckily we have a fix for that. So what I want to do is I want to create a class method here, and we're going to call this new, okay? And the class is going to be a profile. So let's go up here, and shame on us, we didn't define under all, so let's do that now before we do anything else. And then this is just going to export profile. And then down here below that, what I want to do is I want to say p equals typevar, which we'll need to import in a second. And then the first parameter is the variable, and then the second parameter is bound equals to profile in quotes. Okay, so let's import type and typevar from typing. And then down here, the class is going to be of type p. And then into the class, we're going to pass a user, which is a union of member and user. Now, the reason that we're not putting an integer here is because when we instantiate a profile, that has a user has sent a command to the bot in order to cause the profile to be instantiated. So we know for a fact that we're getting a member or user object here and not an integer. Integers are only for when we load from the database and there's an error calling the member or user. Okay, so the other parameter that we're going to pass in here is the guild. And then this is going to return us a finished profile. All right, so how do we instantiate this profile object before assigning it the values that it requires to be instantiated? Well, we're going to do it like this. So self, we're going to create a local variable called self, and it's of type p. And this is going to be equal to class.new, and we're going to pass in the class type. So we're basically creating an empty mold here. And we're saying we want, it's going to be something, and we're instantiating a new object. And because we've done that, we now have an internal reference to the memory location of this object, which is ultimately what we need, which is ultimately what we're doing when we're passing in the parent here. We're just passing in a memory address, ultimately, a pointer that this variable is short for. Okay, so we're creating that empty container so that we have a reference to it in order to pass into our details class. But before we do that, let's assign the ID. And for this, we're going to say new profile record, which we haven't imported. So let's go up to the top and say from utilities, and we'll import star, just like we always do. And now self.id is going to be equal to the new profile entry that we passed, the function that we created in our database script. Okay, so for this we need to fill the guild ID. So guild ID equals guild.id. And then the user ID is equal to user.id. Okay, because remember, new profile entry is going to return us that new unique ID number. So self.user, we can just put equal to the user that we passed in, and then self.guild is equal to the guild. Okay, so lastly, we want to say self.details is equal to a new profile details, okay? And then we're going to pass in self, which is the name of the instantiated container object. So remember, self is kind of blank right now. We haven't finalized what type of class it is, but we're still passing in the reference, the variable reference to that blank object before we've molded it into what we want. And that's how we bypass the need to instantiate a profile before we actually finish instantiating one. Okay, so let's just, right here, we're going to return self. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. It's a little complicated to explain, and feel free to ask questions in the comments because I'd love to answer them. I'd love to get more clarification on it. All right, so next up is the load function. Okay, so we're going to make this a class method as well. And we're going to call it def load. And the class is going to be of type profile. So type P. We're going to pass in a user, which is going to be the same as we've had, a union of member, user, or int. Because this is our load logic, so we may get an integer back for this. I want to pass a guild, which for now is going to be an optional guild. And then I also want to pass in some data, which is going to be a list of information, but it could be anything. Okay, so we're going to put it like that. And this is going to return us a profile. So let me drop this down just for spacing reasons. Okay. So let's make sure that we import list and any from typing. Okay. So honestly, we're going to perform basically the same logic that we're doing here, but we're going to sift through this data. And this data is going to be comprised of all the records pertaining to this profile from the database. And I'll show you how we're going to grab data from each separate table, because remember, for details, for instance, if we look down here, we have a details table. And for personality, we'll have a personality table. For images, we'll have an images table, and so on and so forth. But we don't want to make a query to each of those tables in our load method because that's going to be slow, and that'll take the bot forever to start up if we have a lot of profile records. So we're going to make the query to the database outside the profile class method and just pass in all the data all at once. Okay, we'll go into that in a little bit, but for now, just bear with me. So the logic is going to be similar to what we did up in the new method. So self, which is a profile, is going to be equal to class.new.dunderNew, and then we'll pass in the class type into the parentheses. Self.id is going to be equal to data sub 0. Okay, so when we pull all of that data, no matter what, we're going to have a profile ID as the very first data point. Just trust me on this one, we'll set that up shortly. So self.user is going to be equal to user. Self.guild is going to be equal to the guild that we pass in. And then for now, let's say self.details equals profile details dot load. So the class method that we made in the profile details class is going to take in the profile that we're making right now, this empty container, remember. And then it's also going to take in the data. So for now, I'm just going to say data. Once we get additional sections, we'll split that data into, for instance, data sub 3 through 7. But for now, since this data is only going to be the data coming back for details, that's all we need. And then finally, let's return self. Okay. Oh, and excuse me, this should actually be data sub 1 colon nothing. So we don't need the ID. We've obtained that data point. We've assigned it where it needs to go. So we only need, in this case, the index 1 through the end on our data. Okay, so the time has come to subclass the bot, because if we look at our main file, we're just creating a bot. However, we have no way of storing profiles in this bot. because it's defined by PyCord. It's defined by the library. So we need to make our own subclass in which we can pass these profiles around. So in our classes folder, let's make a new file and we're just going to call it bot. And then let's go ahead and do our imports. So from future, import annotations. From Discord, we're only going to import bot for this because we aren't going to be dealing with any interactions. We're only going to be using the bot to subclass. Let's say from typing, I want to import type checking and list. From utilities, we're going to need the database connection. From classes.profiles, we're going to need profile. And then down here, if we're type checking, well, we're going to pass for now, but we are going to use this import statement here in just a minute. So we're going to use the type checking for an import statement. Okay, let's quickly define our dunder all. And what are we going to call this bot? Well, I'm going to call it frogbot. That's a pretty straightforward way to do it. And equals. Okay, so let's actually define the class now. So it's going to be class frogbot, and this is going to be of type bot. And then underneath that, I'd like to just quickly paste in this doc string here. Since this is a primary construct of our program, I want to be sure that we include a doc string explaining why we're subclassing the bot and not just using a default one. Okay, so let's define our init. And into here, we're going to take args and keyword args. We don't need to get anything special into our bot, but we do need to pass any provided arguments into the superclass constructor, which we'll do now. So let's say args and keyword args. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is I want to define self.frogguilds. Okay, now this may sound silly. However, we can't necessarily define self.guilds because self.guilds, as you can see, is already a property in the client, which the bot is a subclass of client. But we can't build guilds. So we're going to set our guilds data that we're about to create apart from the rest of them by calling it frog guilds, okay? And then this is going to be a list of guild data, which we haven't created yet, but we're going to next. And then when we instantiate our bot, this is going to be empty. Once the bot is up and running, then we're going to load our guild data into this list here. But for now, don't worry about it. Okay, so let's make a guild data class. Okay, let's make this custom class that we're going to use to pass around our data. So in our classes folder, let's make a new Python file called guild. Okay, and the imports in this one are going to be a little bit different. So I'm actually going to skip those until we know exactly what we're putting in here. And I'm just going to start by defining the class. So this is going to be a regular Python class called guild data. Again, we have to set it apart from a regular PyCord or Discord guild, so it doesn't have the same name, so we can use both classes in our project. So let's define the slots. This is going to take a parent guild. So this is going to be the actual Discord guild object that this guild data is referencing. We're going to have our profiles list. And then I want to plan for some configuration later on, because within the configuration module, at least in terms of profiles, this is where we're going to define which channels we can post our profiles to. We don't want this to be a lawless server where you can just be posting profiles to any old channel, right? So later on, we'll define configuration behavior, limiting what channels we're allowed to post in. Okay, but for now, we just need these 3 slots. So let's define our init. And into this, I want to take a parent. So this is going to be a Discord guild. So let's import that. Discord import guild. And additionally, later on, we're going to take our configuration into this, but I'm not going to worry about that for now because we haven't built the configuration module yet. So let's say self.parent, which is a guild, equals the parent. And self.profiles, which is a list of profiles, profile, and that's going to equal an empty list to start. So we want to create this class fully before we load profiles in. All right, so let's also say from typing, we're going to import list, and from classes.profiles, we're going to import profile. And then let's also, at the top, like we always do, from future, import annotations. Okay, great, 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 great. So let's talk about our loading logic. So this is going to be a class method as well. As you can see, there's a bit of a trend with how we load things in this bot. We want the behaviors to more or less be similar so that we don't have logic that we don't expect in other places. So each class is more or less responsible for loading its own data. Okay, so right here we're going to say def load, and this is going to be of type guild data, which we're going to define in a second. It's going to be GD. Our parent is going to be a guild. And then later on we're going to take posting channels, the ones that we can post our profiles to, but for now we aren't going to do that. And then this is going to return a guild data. All right, so let's make sure that we import type and typeVar from typing. And then shame on us, we forgot to define our dunder all again. So let's do that really quickly. And actually this is only going to be one line. Guild data. Okay, and then under that, let's define GD, which is a type variable, and it's bound to guild data, just like that, so that our type checking all works out. So the logic here is going to be more or less the same as the logic, in our profile class. So we need to create that blank cookie cutter first, that blank mold, before we can actually assign values to it. So let's say self, which is guild data, equals class.new, and then enter the class into the parentheses. Guild data, GD. Okay, and then self.parent equals parent. Self.profiles is going to be a new list because we're going to do the load logic for that later on. And then we're also going to add self.configuration in here, but again, we haven't set that up yet. So just these two items. All right, awesome, awesome, awesome. Let's head over into our database script. And what I want to do here is I want to, in our assert database structure, under where we're creating the tables, I want to create a view. And what a view is, think of it as an amalgamation of multiple tables. So we're storing our details information in a details table, and we're going to be storing images in images, as I said before, and so on and so on. This view is going to be one big master table that returns us all the data in those subtables. Okay? I think it's easier just to show you. So let's say c.execute. And then I want to say create or replace view. And we're going to say profile master. And we'll put as. And honestly, a lot of these keywords I just like separating out a little bit for clarity. You can do as you will. And we're going to say select p.profile ID, p.user ID, p.guild ID, and we're going to, in a minute, we're going to define what p means within this statement. So this is going to be referring to the profile table where these primary bits of info are stored, but we're going to define it as a shorter variable p in a minute, okay? And let's go ahead and grab our details information as well. So d.care name, and again we're gonna define d here in a second. The definitions come at the end of the statement. So let's grab all of our variables here. Let's say d.url, and we're gonna say as custom URL. Okay, the reason we're doing this is because we're going to have multiple fields for URL later, particularly when it comes to images. Okay, so we don't want to mix those up. We want to make sure that we define this column that we're creating in the amalgamated view something different. All right, d.color, d.jobs, d.rates, and d.postURL. Okay, these are the only ones we need for now. And let's go down here, and we're going to say from, oops, come here you, from profiles, and now we can define the shortened variable name for profiles. So we're saying the name of the table here, and we can define the shortened name. And then let's go down, and we're going to say join details D on p.profileid d.profileid. Okay, so essentially we're comparing the profile ID information between these two tables, and that's going to compile all the information on a single line for us. Okay, and then let's make sure we end it with a semicolon. Okay, so this should create a view for us that we can extract data from. Oh, and then right here, let's make sure we have the comma inside the quotation marks, or that's going to cause an error. Okay, so now, since we call this assert database structure logic already in our code, since we're making sure that these tables exist, we should be able to make sure that this view exists as well. So let's go ahead and run our bot. We've got a database connection, hopefully. There we go. And we're checking the database logic. And there we go, we're online. So if I bring my database admin software over here, you can see we're here under Frogbot, and I go down to Views, and we've got the Profile Master View right here, which, if we look at it, actually, excuse me, if we look in the SQL pane, this query looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? This guy right here, because that's more or less exactly what we wrote in our code. See, looks pretty similar, huh? All right, cool. So we have a way to retrieve our data in a single statement now, instead of using multiple queries into our database. Awesome. So let's go ahead and query this view in our code. Now let's go back to our main.py file, and we're going to take advantage of the onReady listener that we've already defined. Okay, so I want to say here, I want to put a print statement explaining what we're doing. So we're saying loading custom guild data. And then right here, I want to say for guild in bot.guilds. And before we go any further, excuse me, let's go up here and we're going to import a couple of things. So we're going to say from classes.bot, I want to import frogbot. Okay. And then from classes.guild, import guild data. All right. So the first thing we want to do is substitute in our Frogbot for our bot instance right here. And we can even delete the bot from our imports. Okay, so now we've instantiated our own subclassed bot, which is going to have this frog guilds attribute to it. Okay, so why is that important? So down here for guild in bot.guilds, let's say bot.frogguilds.append, and we're going to say guild data, the class, .load, and we're going to pass in that parent guild. So we're going to iterate through all of the actual Discord guild objects that our parent has, and we're going to create a guild data class out of each of them and put it into our frog guilds, just like that. And there'll be a bit more logic in here when we get our our configuration module set up, because I'm actually going to want to do our posting channel load logic in here as well. But for now, it's going to be a pretty simple statement. So let's drop down and we'll put another print statement. And we'll say loading profiles. Okay, so I'm going to call await bot.load profiles. And this is a function that we haven't created yet, but we're going to define right now. Okay, so let's go back into our bot class, and down here under the constructor, let's define async def load profiles. And it's not going to take anything, and it's going to return nothing as well. Let's make a connection to our database. So C equals dbConnection.cursor. Let's execute a real simple query here. C.execute, and we're going to say select star from profile master. As easy as that. Okay, and that's going to pull all of our records. So let's store that in data. So that'll be C.fetch_all. And then we can close our cursor just to be clean, just to be tidy. Okay, so what do? Now we have all of the data. All the profiles that anyone has ever created are queued in this variable called data. Well, let's loop through that. So for record in data, what do we want to do? We want to, well, first we want to get the user. Okay, because remember, our profiles are composed of an ID number, a user, and a guild. So let's get the user first. We'll say user equals await self, because this is a function that our bot superclass has, self.get or fetch user. And then we're going to put in record sub1. Now, why are we putting in record sub1 here? Well, if we pull up our database master again, and I view our rows, come on, load, load, load. There we go. As you can see, we've got our view down here in the bottom pane down here. And so this is going to be 0, this is going to be 1, this is going to be 2, and this is how we're going to check to see which data point each item in the returned data is. Okay, so our user ID is data point 1. Let's get that. Now, what happens if this is an integer? Or excuse me, what happens if this returns none? This is definitely going to be an integer. What happens if this returns none? Because if we mouse over the function here, you can see that this may return a user or none. So let's just say or record 1 to assign that raw integer that we're keeping in the database as the user value if we can't find a user in Discord. So now what I want to do is I want to say for frog in self.frog guild. So we're going to loop through all of the guild data, and we're going to find which guild we want to put this profile into. So let's say if frog.parent, parent.id. So remember, we're looping through our frog guilds, and the guild data has an attribute called parent, which is the Discord guild object. So we're looking at the guild ID. If that equals record sub2, which remember, if we come over here to our database application, profile ID is 0, user ID is 1, guild ID is 2. So if the guild ID equals the guild ID of the profile record, we're going to say profile equals profile.load, and we're going to give it the user. We're going to give it the guild. I'm sorry. We called that frog. And then I'm also going to give it the record that we're iterating through. Put that in the wrong order. Frog user record. There we go. No, I was right. It's user frog record. We just need to go in here to our profile class. And anywhere we've put guild, we actually need to change that to guild data. Okay? So let's change it there. Let's change it there. And let's change it there and there as well. And we'll make sure that we import it up here. So from classes.guild import guild data. And now our squiggly should be gone. Okay, much better. There we go. So let's say frog, which is our custom guild data class, dot profiles, dot append the profile that we've created from this record. Okay? And then we can break from this inner for loop. All right, so our profiles are getting loaded into the bot right now. So everything should be kosher in that regard, but we don't actually have a way to call the profile up when a user interacts with the bot. So if we go into our cog, all we're doing is we're making a blank profile right now. And in fact, it's not even working. It's not even going to work correctly because we're not calling profile.new, the class method. It's expecting us to pass in these instantiated parameters already. So this isn't going to work anymore. So let's tidy up this cog a little bit. I want to rename this, and I'm going to call it C profiles, because we can just transition this cog into being our profiles cog. Okay, so let's also change the name. And make sure you change the name in the setup function as well. We need to instantiate the class that we're creating in this file. Okay, and then for our bot, so since we're type checking, well, let's put it under if type checking, and we're going to say from classes.bot, we're going to import frogbot. Okay, and let's substitute that in for the bot typing as well, just like that. And then up here at the top, I want to drop down our Discord imports, because these are going to get a bit chonky. So let's do that, and we'll put an ending parenthesis there. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to also import, instead of slash command, I want to import slash command group. Okay, like that. And then down here beneath our constructor for the profiles cog, I'm going to define a slash command group called profiles. That's going to equal a slash command group. And then to this we can pass a name, which is going to be profiles. And we can pass a description, which is going to be profile creation commands, or something along those lines. Okay, so instead of saying at slash command, we can actually use this slash command group variable as a decorator. So we can say at profiles dot command and pass it the same keyword arguments that we would pass the slash command decorator. So for this, I want to actually rename it details, and we'll say async def profile details. And let's drop this down, and we'll also add a description to the command. So description equals view and update name, custom URL, jobs, accent, color, and rates. Let's say that. Okay, so now we're set up with the cog as we're going to be using it in actual production. I think that's the way we're going to do it. So the first thing we need to do, let's go ahead and get rid of this logic. And the first thing that we need to do when looking for a profile is we need to find the guild that the profile is stored in, right? Because we can't just say bot.findProfile. We have to look for the guild where it's stored first. So in our bot class, what I want to do is down here below load profiles, I want to define a function called getFrog. And we can't call this getGuild because there's already a function in the bot superclass called getGuild. So we don't want to override that behavior. So we want to get our own guilds. And then into this, the argument it's going to take is the guild ID, which is an integer, and it's going to return to us a guild data class, just like that. So this logic is going to be pretty simple. We're going to say for frog in self.frogGuilds, if frog.parent.id equals the guild ID that we've passed in, we're going to return the frog. Okay, but currently we're not doing anything with the guild data that we get back. So let's head over into our guild data class, and I'll create a new function down here at the bottom, and let's call it def get profile. And the reason that I want to separate this logic is because in the event that a profile doesn't exist for the user, we're going to create one as part of this function, and I want that particular bit of logic to be within the guild class. Personal preference, you could put all of this logic into the function in the bot if you wanted, but I'm gonna separate out the two functions. So this is going to take self, and this is also going to take a user, which in this case is going to be a union of member or user. And you'll see why we don't simply take the ID in just a second. And then this is going to return us an optional profile. Actually, this is always going to return us a profile. I apologize. One way or the other, we're getting a profile back from this function. Okay, so let's make sure that we do our imports. So from typing, we'll do union, that's it. And then from Discord, we'll do member and user. Okay, no more squigglies. Excellent. So let's iterate through the profiles that we have in self.profiles. And then if the profile.user.id equals the user ID, the ID of the user that we've passed in, let's just return the profile that we found. But what if, God forbid, our user hasn't used this bot before and they don't have a profile? Well, let's make them one. So we'll say profile equals profile.new. And then in the constructor, you can see we need to pass a user and a guild data, right? So the user, that's obvious, that's going to be the user. But now we need to pass in the guild data. Luckily, though, we are in this class, right? So we can just pass the self in here. And let's say self.profiles.append the profile that we've made, and then we'll return that new profile just like that. So if we don't find the profile already in the cache, we're going to make a new one. We're going to add it to the list here in the guild data so that we don't just create a new profile and do nothing with it. And then we're going to return this to the caller. Okay? So where do we call this? Where do we want to call getProfile? Well, now we can finally head back out to our cog, and let's say profile equals guilddata.getProfile, and we'll pass in the ctx.user like that. And now we have our profile. Okay, awesome, awesome. But what do we do from here? We deleted that edit logic. Well, you thought the video was almost over, but we've got a little bit more to go. So let's have each individual profile section define that behavior, define that status message behavior that we want to respond to these commands with. Okay, so let's open up our section. And then let's say right here above the update method, I'm going to create another function, and we're going to call this async def set, S-E-T, and it'll take the self and an interaction, which is of type interaction, and it's not going to return to us anything. Let's raise a not implemented error as we do, and make sure we import interaction right here. Okay. So now we need to import the set method in each of our profile sections. So let's go back to details, and again, right above update, let's implement that. So let's say def set, just like that. But what are we going to do in here? Well, the logic is going to basically be what we did in the cog to demonstrate everything. So I want to instantiate a status message, which is just self.status. And I also want to instantiate a view, which is going to be a details status view. And we need to pass in the interaction.user so it knows who the owner is. And let's also pass in the self, the actual details object, okay? And then down here we can say await interaction.response.send message. And we're going to put in embed equals status embed, and the view equals the view. Let's make sure that we await view.wait, and then we're good. That's all the set logic that we need. Okay, so this needs to get called from our profiles cog. So back here, we're going to say await profile.details.set, and we're going to pass in ctx.interaction, just like that. And whoops, let's go back here and make sure this is async def set so it can interface properly with the await syntax. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this up and see where we're at. I'm not anticipating it to work the first go through. We've most likely made some errors, but let's see what we've got so far. Okay? And all right. So as expected, we have an error. It looks like we have a circular import. So let's go to our guild. Actually, we need to go to our profile. There we go, our profile class. So let's grab this line right here from classes.guild, import guild data, and we need to paste that under type checking. Because remember, we're not actually instantiating a guild data within our profile. We're only using it for the type hinting purposes, so it needs to go under type checking to avoid a circular dependency. Okay, let's try again. Okay, a little bit more success this time. Let's head back into Discord here. Oh, bring it over. Hey, look, activities are free today. Maybe later. Okay, so let's run our new command, profile details. And remember, it's named details now because we changed the name of it in the cog, but it looks like we have an error. So let's head back over. And I know where this one is. Down here in our profile.new class method, we made the mistake of not putting guild.parent.id here. So when we switched from a regular Discord guild to the guild data class, we forgot to call the parent instead of just the regular ID number. Okay, let's try one more time. I wasn't expecting this to go 100% because honestly, we did a lot of coding, a lot of changes in our modules, and things just don't work the first time. That's just how it is. So I just wanted to go through the debugging process with you to give you an idea of how to find errors when they do come up. So let's run our command again. This time with more success, thankfully. Okay, so we've got our status message and our buttons like we did before. Let's go ahead and change our name and see what happens. Okay, so we don't have an update, which means we have an exception. Okay, so this is over here in our profile details. So it looks like here in the update method, I've mistakenly, instead of URL, I've said user. So let's fix that. And while we're here, I noticed another mistake I made. Let's put an equal sign after the color. Okay, because that's going to, obviously that'll cause an exception, and we may as well catch that while we're here. So let's run one more time. Okay. And let's go ahead and run our command. Okay, so we've got some peculiar behavior here. It looks like my Discord ID number is the username and my guild number is the URL. So that's not going to be too hard to fix. Let's go back over into our profile class. And here within the load logic, what's happening is we're taking in, if we look at our profile master view here, we get the data back from this view in this order. Okay, so in descending order. So this is index 0, this is 1, this is 2, and so on. So we've grabbed these, but we don't actually need the user ID and the guild ID in this particular context. Okay? So what we can do is we can get rid of that, and we can minimize this, and we can say, instead of starting at 0, 1, 2, let's start at the third index when we pass the data into profile details. Okay, so this is 0, index 1 is the user, index 2 is the guild, and we'll just start extracting data at index 3 all the way to the end for the time being. All right, let's rerun one more time. I'm feeling good about this. 5th time's a charm, right? Okay, and we'll jump over into Discord and run our command. Okay, so we have nothing. Let's go ahead and try setting our character name. Okay, and everything's updated properly. So let's just double check in our database here. So if I go to my profile master and I view all rows, you can see that we've created a profile successfully, saved it under my user ID and my test server, and then our character name has been saved successfully. Great, awesome. So we're in business. Hey, we finally finished this video. That's exciting. So I think in the next video, we're going to move on to the personality attributes. So our likes, our dislikes, our personality, and our about me as well. So I'm looking forward to it. And thanks again for everyone who's been watching. This has been a real fun time, and look forward to seeing you in the next video.